Hi, welcome to Dawn and Friends. Sitting in for the vacationing Dawn McNiven, I'm Carla Fitzsimmons. On today's show, we're going to talk about the mysterious world of magic with my guest, Darryl Hutton. Stay tuned for this and more coming up right after this. Welcome back. Today my guest is Darryl Hutton. You might know him. He is a magician. I got to get this right.
That's
Should
right.
I call you Mr. Hutton or Darryl?
I think Darryl would be better. I will make it very informal.
Yeah,
In case
well,
I disappear during the interview, you never know with a magician.
Well, not only that, for the audience, they won't know this, but Darryl Hutton was my grade 4 and 5 teacher at Kenilworth Public School. So I just thought I'd let everybody know that tidbit of information beforehand. So welcome to the show, and thanks for joining me.
Thank you.
I was going over my notes and looking over your career. You've accomplished a lot of things. Not only are you a magician, you're a ventriloquist, you're a teacher. What other things have you been doing to keep yourself busy?
Well, I've written a lot of stories. Before I had a vehicle to travel around in, I had a lot of free time, and I would spend my time writing children's stories, and I was fortunate in getting some of them published, and also writing a column called The Dummy Speaks.
Mm-hmm.
Some people had trouble figuring out which one was a dummy, but I think the idea was I was writing about magic and ventriloquism, and I wrote a column for the Society of Canadian Magicians for about 7 years, and I had a big stack of these columns, and at the end of 7 years it was kind of a job without pay.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, no, I must do something with all of these columns, so I decided to collate them and organize them into chapters and try and put them into a book. And I realized the hard part of getting something published is finding a publisher that will handle someone who's Canadian.
And that must be pretty difficult in Canada. So what were you forced to do?
I was very determined. I wrote to 40 different companies, and they would say, oh, it's a wonderful idea, but there's not really a big market for ventriloquism. We liked your idea and the way you put it together. And so I said, maybe if I try it out of the country. So I wrote to a British company, K & Ward, a publishing company, and I got a letter back saying, in a couple years we might consider publishing your book, which to me was a polite way of saying thanks, but no thanks.
Yeah.
And fortunately, I had written a book called Dove Worker's Handbook, which was published when I was around 17 years of age. And the manager of the publishing company, his son, was a magician, and said, I know that name, Darryl Hutton. I have a book by him, and showed it to his dad. And within the next couple of weeks, I received a contract to publish the first book called Ventriloquism. And so I was quite happy about that, all because the fella had remembered my face, something that most people don't forget.
So how many books have you written to date?
Well, I started with a British one here, which is called Modern Ventriloquism. And by the way, the young boy that recognized my name from the other book did the whole cover in a pointillism design. So that's one. And then an American version came out by Sterling Publishers a few years later. So I had to rewrite it, getting rid of all the British terminology like lift, face cloth, and things like that, and put it into American terms. And then without my knowledge, it came out a few years after that in soft cover, and it was published in Australia and in Canada. And unfortunately, they didn't even use my partner's picture in the cover. But I forgave them because the royalty checks twice a year made all the difference in the world for me. So probably, I would say maybe 5, 6, 7 different things over the past few years.
Now, with your novels, such as this one here, where's my camera? Roger's Last Olay.
Right.
I actually read this. I think it was grade 4. Did I read this?
Grade 4,
Grade
right?
4. I remember
That's
reading
right.
this, and this is an excellent book. Where did you come up with the idea for the characters and the plot and that type of stuff? Was it something that
The
you...
characters were kind of a compilation of different people. I don't like to take just one person when you're making up a character. You might take a bit of cowardice from one person and a bit of boldness from another and roll it together into a composite character. And that's what I did. So part of myself is in the book. I'm not going to say which part because it's about a little fellow who was bothered by a bully, and instead of facing up to the problems of a bully, he would go into his own world of imagination back to the ancient days of Rome and that. So there's kind of a historical component to the
Very
book
much
as
so.
well.
And I did notice some Cambridge sort of mentions. You were talking about the Quarry Bridge, and I'm from Cambridge, so I recognize that.
You recognize
Yes.
some of the things, yeah.
Yeah.
So there's a bit of myself in it too,
Yeah.
and I had quite a few extra copies because a nonfiction book such as ventriloquism will sell a lot more copies if you're an unknown author, and being Canadian, and I was unknown, and so the Rogers Lastolay, if you're unknown, you really have to push it yourself, and that I found the big problem was I was asked to do a book signing show for my book on ventriloquism in the Fairview Plaza, and a Canadian company, I won't mention the company, was distributing the book, and I asked for 6 copies, and it took a month, and I only got 12 copies. Whereas with the American book, if I wanted 100 copies within a week, I would get them. And it just shows the difference
Yeah.
in the American and Canadian distribution systems. So I was very disappointed in that because people would come up and I'd say, I'll take your address. And I mean, people don't want to buy something and have it sent to them.
Exactly.
They want it right then and there, and they want you to sign it there. So I was a bit disappointed in that.
That would be discouraging.
It was. It was a bit discouraging.
Now, what advice would you give to an upcoming writer or novelist that's trying to get their first works published or has been published but didn't do as...
But didn't do as well. Well, the first thing is, if you're a beginning writer, is to have a notebook. Just like an artist would have a notebook, and you have to, a writer, just like an artist, has to see things a little bit differently in a little more detail. So if you see two retired gentlemen sitting on a park bench and you're walking by, you might overhear a snatch of conversation and jot it down in your book. Or something unusual on a TV program, an unusual way of saying things, an interesting phrase in the paper or an article about a runaway child or something. There again, you have the germ for a story, ready to explode into a real living plot. So ideas come from every place, but the thing is you have to record them in a writer's journal, notebook, whatever you want to call it, and then you could rely upon that. And the only way you learn to write is by writing. I have a whole shelf filled with rejects. The Curse of the Phantom Papoose. That was a scary one. That's when I was going through my Stephen King phase. And I have one called Jodi's Miraculous Journey. That's after I got interested in The Hobbit, Tolkien's The Hobbit, and then I went through Lord of the Rings, and I said, I have to write something like this. So I wrote a story about a boy in a wheelchair. He was crippled not only with his legs, physically, but he was crippled because he couldn't read. And if you can't read, that's like being in a wheelchair.
Exactly.
And so he went on a journey of adventure. It was sort of like an Alice in Wonderland, but using dragons and monsters and things like that to show all the battles that he had to fight in order to learn to read. So it was kind of an interesting book. I really enjoyed it because my grade 5 class helped me solve one of the problems in one of the chapters. Because every chapter, in a way, is like a little book. You have a setting, and you introduce your characters. They have a problem, and then they have to try and overcome the problem. So I would ask the grade 5s, now, what do you think? How would they get this message from this cell to that cell if they were in different cells underground? And they came up with making paper boats with messages and floating them downstream and that. So it's quite interesting, the ideas the kids would come up with. And I actually did use one of their ideas in the finished copy of the book. So that's the best advice for writers that I can think of.
Did you start off doing short stories first and then progress into writing novels, or was it more that you got working away and then you chose to do a novel? Like, because I find as a writer, you can't just stop writing,
No.
if it's coming along,
See,
you
well,
develop it.
unfortunately, like my talking, my stories tend to get stretched as well. And I would start with a short story, but then I would have padding and more description. And if you've ever read The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, I mean, the descriptions go on and on. You can't just go over a mountain. There's 4 descriptive paragraphs before you even get to the first ledge of the mountain. And writers tend to be like Peter Benchley when he wrote Jaws. Wrote 300 pages more than was actually published. and those pages are pulled out later. It's better to overwrite and then weed out the other parts and that. So I would probably be the world's worst short story writer.
I think I would be too. I think I'd be
right.
right
I
there.
write a column in the Linking Ring magazine. It's the meeting sort of what happens at our local meetings, and you're supposed to have it on 2 pages. And more than once, I've had my article cut because I tend to not want to shortchange anyone. So I go into great detail about what they did and how they performed and so forth. And I sort of developed a reputation for being long-winded, which might be good and bad in the same breath.
I think it could be good and bad, especially being that you're a ventriloquist. I
Right.
mean, that obviously is going to pay off as well as a magician.
That's right.
It brings your audience into what you're doing, and
That's right.
you're very animated. How did you begin to be involved with being a magician and ventriloquist?
And ventriloquism. Okay, it's actually 2 separate stories. When kids ask me how I started, I tell them about, I was reading through the paper one day. It was on my, I didn't read that much when I was young, just the regular books like the Hardy Boys and that, but I did notice a picture of a magician cutting a child's head off in a guillotine, and the name under it in fancy letters said Harold Sadler. And I said, I recognize this address. This is only 3 blocks from where I live in Cambridge. And I got on my little bike without my parents' permission. I must have been all of 9 or 10. And I wheeled right down to that Rose Street, rapped on the door, and a policeman answered. I didn't realize he was a policeman because in the newspaper he had a full-dress tuxedo on, and here I was, a policeman at the door. I saw your picture in the paper. I would like to do magic too. He invited me in. Took me down to the basement. The wall was lined with books. He had big trunks with costumes. In fact, his uncle was the chief assistant for Howard Thurston, a famous magician back in vaudeville times. And so he gave me a little shirt to keep that belonged to one of the child performers on the show, showed me some of these big illusions and the books. And he had one section on witchcraft, and he said, never, ever have anything to do with that. He said his aunt got into that, and she got into all sorts of problems.
And that's a totally different...
No, it is. It's a completely... The type of magic I do is a white magic. That's why when you see a magic wand, it's black. There's a little bit of sort of mystery involved, but the ends are white. That's so that the evil can't escape from the ends of the wand.
Yeah, I've always
That's
wondered
why
that.
the ends are white. Okay, and that's a kind of an unusual story. But that's how I got started. Then I got the magic kit, and I would sit on my grandmother's rocker in the front veranda and rock back and forth, and I'd read another trick, and I'd rock back and forth, read another trick, and, well, people say, well, when did you become a magician? Well, when I fell off my rocker. And that's partly true, because doing magic is just not sleight of hand, but it's also entertainment. So it's not fooling the audience is fine, but a lot of beginning magicians think that, oh, if I fool them, I'll be a good magician. But you have to fool them agreeably. In other words, with an entertainment element to it, because if they're not entertained and happy when you're finished, they're not going to enjoy you and call you back again.
Well, would you like to do a trick now?
Yes, I would.
We'll actually go to a trick. We'll let him have a sip of water, and then we'll go into a trick, and then you can continue talking about...
Okay. I'm just going to put a turban on here. This will help me do a little bit of concentration here. And I hope that the glitter on the turban doesn't cause the camera to explode or anything. Now, I'm going to have you pick a card, but these are not ordinary cards. And please notice when I do this effect that my fingers never leave my hands. Okay. Instead of using regular cards, because I know that you probably have a lot of kids watching, and so I'm going to use words now. So I'll explain a few of the words, and then I'm going to have you choose one of these words. First of all, we have totem pole. That's when you have a lot of toads stacked on top of each other. And then we have manual labor. He's a little Spanish boy who lives next door with his grandmother, okay? And then we have intent. That's what people do when they go camping. And then we have outlet. That's a little out. And we have adamant. I think that was the first ant in the world, wasn't it? Adamant. And uncanny. That's a place without any washrooms. And then we have detail. I think that's the part that goes over defense last. And fortress. Yeah, that's a female fort. And then we have Thailand. Isn't that where they make all that nice neckwear? I think so. And surgeon, kind of fish, I believe. And celery, that's what they pay you at the end of the week, I think. It's spelled with a C. I hope too many kids aren't watching. Barium, isn't that what doctors do when they sort of make a mistake? Okay, those are just a few words. And would you pull one of those out, please? Okay, and just show it to the cameras out there so they get a good, clear view. Very good.
Okay, I think the camera's got it now.
And put it in the pack any place at all.
Okay.
And I'm just going to place an elastic band around it. And do you like pets?
I do.
You do.
Yes, I
Snakes?
do. Not snakes.
Not snakes. Unfortunately, I just happen to have my pet snake here today. And